Now, I've got a couple of graphs here, and the first graph is a change in Canada's oil and gas sector greenhouse gas emissions since 2005. And I'm hoping that with the camera you'll be able to see this. The dark blue line represents the increase from oil sands production. You'll notice that it has gone up about 40%, and 40% of all oil and gas emissions are from the oil sands, and they represent about 87 megatons in emissions. For reference, Canada's emissions sit at around 708 megatons, so that's
Mr.
a very,
Van Koeverden,
very considerable.
I'm told the same rules apply in committee as in the House with regards to props.
Well, there's no other way that I can share this graph, but as everybody can see, this the oil and gas emissions have gone up quite dramatically. Mr. Kruger, are you familiar with this? Are you familiar with the 87 megaton contribution just from the oil sands in Canada to Canada's overall emissions?
I'm not familiar with the graph. It wasn't legible to me, but I am familiar with generally emissions increase as is related to production increase with Canada's growing share of the world's oil markets.
Okay, I'm glad that you referenced the total production going up, because that's very true. What's also gone up is the individual emissions intensity per barrel. I have another graph here. I won't hold it up. It indicates a 9% increase in the emissions intensity per barrel of oil in Canada. Do you agree that the emissions intensity per barrel of crude oil in the oil sands has gone up as a result of longer distances, access to mines and processing facilities?
I can't speak to the oil sands overall, but I'm looking at a comparable chart for our company where I would say it's been essentially flat over the last 5 years from an intensity standpoint.
Okay, well, my graph goes back a lot farther than that, to 2004, and what I see is more than a 10% increase in emissions intensity per barrel of crude from the oil sands. Now, here I have a comparison of the emissions intensity per barrel, kilograms per CO2 per barrel, of various types of oil and gas. And like I said, I'm focusing on the oil sands here. The oil sands have an average emissions intensity of about 174 kilograms per CO2, whereas U.S. Bakken with no flare is around 24 kilograms per CO2. Mexico Cantorell is around 40. Even U.S. Alaska North Slope is just over 174 kilograms of CO2 per barrel of oil. And like I said, that's been going up over the last 20 years or so. 174 kilograms of CO2 in emissions per barrel, and that's, again, emissions intensity per barrel in the oil sands. This is just extraction and processing emissions before it's even used. So when people, particularly, I've heard it a couple of times today, but conservative politicians regularly say that Canada needs more oil and gas. You know what? I tend to agree. If we can produce it more ethically and with a lower carbon intensity, then certainly. But have we demonstrated an ability to reduce the carbon emissions per barrel of bitumen extraction in the oil sands? Because everything that I'm reading here indicates that it's upwards of 7 times more oil intensive than oil elsewhere. So where's the rationale for Canada oil sands being way less carbon intensive? It seems like it's the opposite of what's true.
Well, again, I don't have the benefit of the data and charts you're looking at. Had they been shared ahead of time, might have been able to more directly comment then. But I would say generally, and I know 3 companies represented on this call today have invested tens of billions of dollars in new generation mining that has essentially produces a barrel that is an equivalent of a barrel refined in the U.S. today. We've done that at Fort Hills, and I'll let my other colleagues speak, but it's called paraffinic froth treatment. It is a technology that has been developed in Canada that allows Canadian barrels to be competitive on the world scale. I'll add one other quick one. One of my colleagues also mentioned what they're doing with in situ technologies to introduce solvents that dramatically reduce the carbon intensity. I think therein lies the answer that Canadians, when given the opportunity, their technology, their ingenuity, can achieve the climate objectives and benefit Canada and Canadians at the same time.
And sure, Mr. Kruger, I would tend to agree with you that it's possible, but it hasn't been demonstrated yet because, like I said, Canada's oil sands per barrel emissions are 7 times higher than an alternative. So when people say that we should be lowering the emissions of the oil and gas production average around the world by increasing emissions from our oil sands, it just doesn't add up. There's more emissions per barrel from our oil sands production than literally any type of oil or gas around the world. So again, I'll read your quote precisely. It says, "The world will not consume one less barrel of oil simply because Canada chooses not to provide it. That barrel will come from somewhere else, and in most cases, somewhere with less commitment to responsible development and climate action." Mr. Kruger, it's demonstrated right here that Canada Oil Sands bitumen is the highest emissions product on the market today. Is it going to go down? Is it going to get towards, U.S. Bakken? Can we get it under 100 kilograms of CO2 per barrel?
A very brief response, please.
Well, I think the answer is if by working together, we talked about the Pathways Alliance, for example, there are major opportunities to do that. And when we do that, the world benefits, Canadians benefit, and Canadian industries benefit. So yeah, I'm a believer that the answer to that's yes.
Well, Canadians are relying on you. I really hope we can get oil sands emissions down.
Merci.
Now, I'm looking at a graph here that I used earlier. Canadian oil sands have an emissions intensity of, on average, about 174 kilograms of CO2 per barrel. Mexico, Cantrell, for example, 40 kilograms per CO2 per emissions. So if we were to take the exact same number of barrels away from the oil sands, if we were to shift all of that production of crude oil to Mexico and reduce the average emissions intensity per barrel by that amount, like how can every witness on the committee today agree that emissions would go up if the most emissions intensive barrels of oil, and I'm just talking about oil sands here, were replaced by lower emitting barrels? Could somebody please explain that to me?
Yeah, I'll comment. So I guess your premise, your suggestion is shutting down the oil sands makes the world a better place. I don't subscribe to that theory because I think of what we're doing on.
For clarity, Mr. Kruger, I'm sorry I have limited time. I was not suggesting shutting down the oil sands, but if we could improve the emissions intensity. Yeah, if we can improve
I thought that was the basis of your question. I thought you started it by if you shut down the oil sands, doesn't it come from somewhere else? So, okay. I'm sorry, my misunderstanding. I'll let you clarify.
Yeah, what I said was if we were to move production from one place to another, and just oil sands, okay, we're just talking about the oil sands, not Canadian energy production, because you said we should bet on Canadians, and I 100% agree. I would like to bet on the Canadians that were working in solar and wind that you sold off from Suncor. I 100% believe that Canada should continue to develop our exceptional energy reserves. I want to be proud of it. I'm on Team Canada, as it's been accused that I might not be. I'm on 100% on Team Canada. I want to be proud of what natural resources we are able to get to market. But Canadians aren't proud of a product that is 7 times dirtier, 7 times more carbon intensive, that's contributing to more than 12% of Canada's total emissions. The oil sands in Canada are responsible for more emissions than the entire province of Ontario and the Ontario and Quebec combined. That's the daily activities and all the industry in both provinces. We've got a lot of work to do
in this matter. But to the witnesses that are here today, in the last 2 years, the top 4 oil sands companies made $59 billion in profits. As was mentioned by Mr. Kruger, record profits were made. Yet the Pembina Institute notes that there were no new investments in emissions reductions. And 75% of your cash flow was redistributed to share buybacks and dividends. But in 2022, only 0.4% actually went into emissions reductions. So at present, Canada is offering a 50% investment tax credit for carbon capture projects, and Alberta's now proposed 12% on top of that. And so these investments they're eligible back to 2022 in Canada's case. So I just would need a number, perhaps from Mr. McKenzie. What percentage of this project are you expecting the public to cover?
Yeah, we've been really clear as an industry that we're willing to invest in carbon capture and sequestration. We see, where I think I've said in my opening remarks, that we're about 25% of the existing GHG emissions in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. McKenzie. I just need a number.
Yeah, and the numbers that we were talking about, I don't think are out of line with the numbers that you talked about. I think the piece that you're missing is the operating costs that go with it. So it's not only the capital investment up front, but it's also the operating costs that go with carbon capture and sequestration.
Thank you, Mr. McKenzie. So the overwhelming majority of your companies are foreign-owned. Mr. Corson, in your company, Imperials Matter, only 21% of your company is Canadian-owned. So why do you think it's fair that Canadians should foot this percentage of the project, 50%, when we're running estimated $50 billion deficit last year, when your companies are making record profits in order to clean up emissions coming from your projects, when 79% of the benefit from it could be going out of the country?
Well, the benefit of decarbonization helps everybody, and that's what we're focused on. This project is unprecedented. It will allow us to significantly decarbonize our operations in the near term, long term, achieve net zero by 2050, and at the same time, continue to produce oil that Canadians need and desire because it is beneficial to their standard of living. It brings jobs, and it brings significant royalty and tax revenues that are important to balance the budget of Canadians. So when the oil industry is successful, is profitable, then everybody wins.
Thank you, Mr. Corson. In the last year and a half, the 5 companies that are represented here today have lobbied the Government of Canada on average each calendar day. And while I really appreciate everybody appearing virtually, you're not here today to speak about that, in spite of having this amount of lobbying meetings. What we do have in the crowd, we do have people that today share their stories of how their lives were turned upside down by climate-fueled disasters, whether that's wildfires burning down homes, whether that's floods completely making homes inhabitable, to homes literally being incinerated in 10 to 15 minutes. So, Mr. Kruger, my question to you is, what would you like to say to those folks that are here today that have been deeply impacted by fossil fuels, the burning of fossil fuels that your company and companies represented here are disproportionately responsible for?
Well, I think you're making the point I made earlier that Canadians nationwide expect business leaders and political leaders to work together to benefit Canada with this tremendous endowment of resource we have, and to do it in the right way that benefits Canadians and the globe. That was, quite frankly, that was what I had to say in my opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Kruger. And I think I'll just end on this. It's abundantly clear. What I hear from my constituents all the time is that they're tired of being lied to from the fossil fuel sector. They're tired of seeing the greenwashing that's out there. And frankly, that's why we put forward changes to the Competition Act that's going to require you to provide evidence when you make these kinds of environmental statements. And what we've heard today makes it so abundantly clear why we need an emissions cap.
Words are all fine and good, but it really depends on the context and who is listening to those words. So when you talk about the oil and gas industry and being good for Canadians, Mr. McKenzie, it really depends on how you define good. When you were speaking of it, it was all economic measurements. And I would suggest you left out a couple economic measurements, such as share prices and executive compensation. But most Canadians believe that what is good for Canadians is actually keeping global temperature increases to less than 1.5 and certainly 2 degrees Celsius. They believe that good health and economic justice is good for Canadians. And they believe that not seeing out-of-control forest fires, floods, and droughts is certainly good. And Indigenous people that I've spoken to also believe that we have a duty to protect our planet for the next 7 generations. So it seems that that is in a little bit of opposition to the economic good that you referenced. Additionally, the social accountability and climate action measures that you mentioned, Mr. Kruger, it's one of the reasons you're here, because it doesn't seem that the oil and gas industry is actually living up to those measures that we have in place in Canada. And with the increase in production of fossil fuels, carbon emissions have continued to increase. And the industry is against a cap on emissions, which actually would provide social accountability and more climate action. Also against methane regulations. And all those things would help to actually ensure that Canadians believe that the social accountability and climate action we want in Canada were being met by the oil and gas industry. And lastly, Susanna, our youth are not in good spirits. I speak to many of them, and they're experiencing climate anxiety and despair, quite frankly. You know, elderly people are suffering from heat domes, poor air quality. Homeowners have seen their homes washed away, and farmers who are struggling to keep their farms out with droughts. So this is a different reality than you're talking about. And I really believe that given that your emissions from the industry have increased, and you have this belief that you'll meet the goals by 2050, but we haven't seen the action. And there seems to be a lot of uncertainty about the industry actually meeting its goals for 2030 that were set, the 22 megatons. So I would like to request that every one of the companies table their specific plans and investments that they're going to be making that have been board approved to get to net zero with the 2030 interim targets, and what investments you have made and are going to make to actually reach those goals. Because while words are good, actions are better.